Hello and welcome to episode 3 of the Peppermint Philosophy podcast. I'm your host, Adam Burgess, and that was the creaking of my chair. If you haven't listened to this before, basically I just sort of reflect on some thought I've had through the day or the week or whatever it might be for about an hour or so, and then basically hopefully come up with some sort of idea or just think it through as a form of meditation. I haven't really thought out an intro. I probably should make it sound a little bit more professional, but grab yourself a drink. I've got some peppermint tea here. Oh, fuck. Sorry, excuse that. I just I tried to breathe as I took a sip. That was stupid. I might just leave that in. Fuck. Sorry about that. As you can tell from that last 30 seconds, I'm not very good at this, but I don't really give a shit. It's all a learning process. But yeah, grab yourself a drink. It could be some tea, it could be something stronger. Whatever you want, and let's just dive in. So I was sort of I was on a walk earlier. Just I've started doing these walks when, especially if the sun comes out, even if it's a little bit windy, just walk along the seafront and just look out at the waves and everything that's going on. Just relax for a little while. Man me, sorry, I was burping. And recently I've been coming across, I say recently, for the last sort of couple of months, I befriended this bloke, and he sort of comes along, he drives along in like a maroon car. He's this old chap called Roy, and he's an absolute gem. But he's just, I've sort of developed a friendship with him over the course of lockdown, where we just stop and chat for a while. Just talk about things that are on our minds, just things that are going on, how we are doing, and sort of like this almost. We just sort of discuss thoughts that we've had. It's lovely. He's like, he's this ex-Navy bloke, but he's ex-Navy. He's turned pacifist, and he's got these incredible stories just about people he's met, things he's done, and he has an interesting perspective, and he loves to just listen and reflect, and we have these lovely exchanges of just ideas. I don't know if hopefully he walks away with something to think about. I think he said to me actually that he loves the conversations because we have something to think about at the end. I certainly just reflect on it quite a bit. And actually, a lot of the stuff that we talk about, I kind of probably has influenced the last couple of episodes. But we just sort of... So I was walking along, I ran into him. We had a pleasant, lovely conversation, just sort of talking about current issues, the fact that people are just sort of wound up and angry all the time. And it got me thinking about perspectives and trying to put things in perspective, because I feel like so often we can get so caught up in our own lives, caught up in the things that are going on, that we forget just how lucky we are almost, how we've got so much to be thankful for, and that even when we're in really struggling times, there can be some, there are places where it's a million times worse than here. And now I don't want that to be taken as meaning, there aren't people who are suffering in Britain or America or other Western nations. There almost certainly are. And I don't want it to be sort of considered that it's just like, oh, well, just suck it up because that's going to be okay, whatever. And I wholeheartedly accept the fact that, and I think I talked about this in the last episode, that I'm coming from this perspective of just being, I'm in this fairly cushy position, I have relatively few concerns compared to a lot of people, that I can sit here, record a podcast and just talk about shit like this. I don't have to worry about children. I don't have to worry about an elderly member of my family. I don't have to be, I'm not in a position where I have to care for someone. So I'm incredibly, incredibly lucky and privileged when it comes to that sort of stuff. But I think it got me thinking about some of the struggles. So Roy was talking about, and hopefully one day, once this is up and running, I might ask Roy to join me for a conversation, because I think he's just full of these interesting anecdotes, and he's got lovely ideas, and it's just the kind of conversation you can just sort of, I could easily just sit there for an hour just talking with him about, just things that are on our minds, and, it takes that sort of organic form. But Roy was talking about volunteer work. He's very interested in what's going on in the Yemen at the moment, and how people there living in these camps, which are, you see children born in these camps basically just starving to death. The kinds of, these young children who are skin and bones, and they weigh, I think the way he put it, he said they weigh, it feels like you're holding feathers. And they've, in some ways, a lot of these people, we're talking about lockdown now, and we're feeling so trapped by it, angry and frustrated and loopy and whatnot. But there are places, like refugee camps, where there are people who are starving. They can't leave their tent. They're trapped in these small areas shared with many people. It's not sanitary. It's not safe for the spread of disease. It's all of these things, and they've been in that position for years. A lot of these crises have been going on for decades, or almost a decade, however long it might be. I fully admit that I'm not. The Yemen is something that came into my sort of perception fairly recently, actually, but I think it's one of those things that I feel like I should educate myself on more. These people are just suffering and essentially under lockdown times a million. It's way worse than what we have at the moment. And, they don't even have the simplest freedom to be able to go out for a walk, So I guess, in some ways, those kinds of things put life into perspective. We complain so much about what's going on, and I understand. I mean, again, I want to have this whole conversation with the caveat of, I'm aware that I'm, there's, of course, part of perspectives is understanding that there is still, a level of suffering which is happening here that I can't be aware of because I'm not living it. And I just suppose the thing that got me thinking is that we don't consider these places where there's just these sorts of daily atrocities going on, these daily degradations of conditions that we don't even think about because they don't come into our, periphery vision that often. They're there. There are news articles out there talking about these incidences, these struggles, and we see them, we feel sad, we might even be angry for a short amount of time. But then, 24 hours later, there's a whole new news cycle. Donald Trump says something, Boris Johnson does this, Dominic Cummings goes back to Durham or something, and then everything is just swept away, forgotten, and we never come back to it. And, that's kind of happened with the Rohingya in Myanmar. It's happened with the Uyghur in Western China. These atrocities, these human rights catastrophes almost, comparable to, shit that the Soviet Union were doing in the last 100 years. And because no one really seems to know about it, or it's not really reported, we end up with this kind of, I guess, narrow perspective of what's wrong. And I was kind of thinking about this. I was talking to Roy about it. Part of me can understand where it's coming from, because I feel like when you're living your daily life, what's your biggest concerns, really? You're worried about your job, your life, paying your bills, the people around you that you care about. And each level up that you go beyond that, you're kind of having to commit more of your time to and your concern to. And there's only so far that it can stretch. And so a lot of issues seem to be focused on these very local problems and things that are going on. But then I thought about it a little bit, and I was just like, well, hang on a minute. That all might be true, but at the same time, there are people in this country who seem to know more and give more of a shit about what's happening in American politics than they do about what's happening here. And I feel like maybe this is just because of, part of why I stepped away from social media was because I feel like it was warping my perspective, focusing it too much on things like hatred, anger, these sorts of news articles, stories, things that are almost designed to provoke an emotional response. But it's all focused on, you've got the stuff that's focused on here, of course, because you need to have domestic news to know what's going on. But so much of what we focus on is what's happening in America. And America's far away from us. And we talk about how it's like, it's because it's similar to us, it's connected to us. We know more about American news, American elections, the presidency of Donald Trump, than we do about our closest neighbours, like France, Germany, the European Union. We know more about the United States than we do about any other sort of country. I think I would, bet my bottom dollar on it, right? And yet, comparably, some of the atrocities going on in the world, the Yemen, the Rohingya, the Uyghur in China, they are miles worse. And I stand by that. That is it. What's happening there is, don't get me wrong, I'm not trying to downplay problems that are happening in other parts of the world, but you have these huge atrocities going on in all of these other countries daily, and they've been going on for a long time. Some of them potentially, arguably, could be comparable to genocide almost. And I'm going a bit off track here, but I guess my real point is that when we take a step back, how much of it is the fact that it's better to be focused on ourselves, or it's easier to focus on things closer to home, and how much of it is that the media are purely focusing on specific aspects. And I know this is getting a bit conspiratorial, don't get me wrong, I'm not a lunatic who thinks that it's all crazy, some big plan. I think it's because media companies, things like that, journalists, they're all individuals, right? It's made up of individuals. And just like how on social media you can get tied into a bubble, a perspective that's only your side, and you start ignoring the other side, and you get into this habit of just not thinking that they exist, or that your only perception of their opinion is what your people say their opinion is, or whatever it might be. I think the same thing's happening with media companies, right? In the West, we have so many media companies that are just looping around, feeding off of each other, feeding off previous thoughts. They're just going round and round and round in circles, chasing their tails, talking about America, talking about, shit that's happening. I mean, basically it's just America, right? We have two tiers of news, really, in the UK, I'd argue. You have what's happening at home. Oh, no, sorry, 3 tiers. You have what's happening at home. That's kind of like what most of the news is, or the majority of stuff that's happening on the news. Then you have what's happening in America, which takes up another big portion of the daily news. What shit has Donald Trump said, because it's very, it's one of those things that gets you a lot of interaction. And then the third tier, which is right at the bottom, is what's happening in the rest of the world. How many people knew about this conflict that happened between India and China in Kashmir? How many people even know about, I keep bringing it up, but the Uyghur and the Rohingya, right? How many people know about that? How many people even care? How many people care about the Yemen? How many people know about the Yemen? Me, even as someone who self-proclaims to care about these things, I even don't know that much about the Yemen, right? The Yemen situation. But there are all these atrocities that are going on, and we lose perspective so often because we're either too insular or too focused on basically shit that, it doesn't affect us, but it's just trendy to get angry at, like Donald Trump. And I'm not saying you shouldn't be angry at Donald Trump. He's a piece of shit. I don't want to get too political with any of this sort of content, but whatever. My point is that why are you focusing so much on these things and then totally ignoring? And I don't think it's yours or mine or anyone's fault, really. Is that we got caught in this weird cycle where we've kind of lost perspective of kind of the fact that actually there's a big portion of the world who are not living under the same kinds of freedoms and good graces as us. And we're very lucky in that regard. And one thing that I've been reading recently, I've started reading, I've gotten about 1/5 of the way through, the Gulag Archipelago by, I can't remember his first name, but Solzhenitsn, probably butchered that. But he was imprisoned in a gulag for 10 years, and it's kind of like, I guess, a kind of historical perspective of the whole sort of Soviet Union Bolshevik, establishment of this kind of system of slavery, basically creating concentration camps as a systemic system, and then in doing so, they created them, and it's so interesting how much of it is so comparable to Nazi Germany. We talk so much, we know so much. I'd say more people know so much about Nazi Germany and its atrocities over the course of 10 years or whatever it was. But comparably, hardly anyone knows about the almost, 60, 70 years of horrendous horrendous Soviet atrocities under Stalin and other people following him. And essentially, I mean, they covered it up because they weren't allowing any, press. They weren't allowing any sort of freedom of speech, freedom of expression, all of these things that we kind of take for granted, that none of that was allowed. And in the end, it led to intellectuals and people saying that the Soviet Union was so much better than our model in the West, or whatever it might have been. And then you ended up with this situation where suddenly it's exposed, and that's the reason why their system was working, because they were enslaving people arbitrarily based on race, ethnicity, religion. They didn't like the way that you looked at them, anything. And it's disgusting, it's despicable, it's hard to read. But it's just, it's a reflection. I mean, but the thing is that you can easily see this kind of thing happening in the world right now. And it put it into perspective because it's so similar to what's happening in Western China with the Uyghur, where it's, re-education facilities in quotation marks based on, all this, this Muslim population. They're forming these terrorist groups, separatist groups, whatever. And they're just talking, it's taking men and boys and putting them in these camps, not allowing anyone to actually document what they're doing. They've been expanding. We've seen that through satellite images. And then on the other hand, then they've also been moving other people into the area to try and, repopulate it with other ethnic groups. And it's disgusting, right? But it's hardly reported. And this is an ongoing situation. It's been going on for 2-3 years, possibly longer. And no one cares. And it's sad, because these things are happening day in, day out. But anyway, sorry, I went off on a wild tangent there. As you can tell, that's something that is quite close to home. And I care about quite a bit. But getting back to the whole idea of, viewing your life in perspective and how it's so easy. I think, so another little anecdote. So my mum, she grew up in Bangladesh. And my mother's family were actually very, very poor. And so I don't know tons about how my mother grew up, why they were poor and so on. The story I was told, and it's one of those things, families try and protect their children from horrible things, The whole thing about being a parent that I've seen is that often you get into this point of trying to protect your children from shit that you've seen. But in doing so, they kind of don't understand why they're being protected, what the real dangers are. And so it can kind of backfire. But I think I've understood quite a bit of what my mother experienced as essentially dirt poor in one of the world's poorest countries. And so basically my grandfather he was Bengali. My grandmother, she was sort of, she's described as Indian, but it's like West Bengal, so it's pretty much on the border with Bangladesh. She married my grandfather, and they kind of, they didn't have much in the way, they didn't have much money. And so in Bangladesh, when you walk down the streets, you can see it. I mean, you still can. It's starting to modernize quite a bit, but you still get these things still exist in the underbellies, right? And so you can see when you walk around. So there are these parts. Essentially, they're like ghettos, or favelas is what they're called in in Brazil, but in Bangladesh they're called boshtis, and they're basically just these sort of shanty town, very poor residencies, where the houses are like shacks made out of, bits of wood and metal grating and all sorts of shit, right? So there are still, I still have aunties and uncles who live in places like this, and I visited them. And it's just an interesting thing. But when you're walking around these places, you can see so many people they have nothing. They have a roof which they've managed to build over their head, maybe. But you see so many people, women with young children, just sort of sat at the side of the road with a bowl of rice and just begging so they can feed their child. You see old men who've lost their legs in a construction accident, and they're, hobbling around, essentially, using their arms. And they've got wooden planks on their legs, or what's left of their legs. And they're just sort of sliding along, begging. And so my mother grew up in that environment, as I understand it. And I know that my nanny used her to beg. And so a child is a good, because who can walk past a starving child or a child and just, you can't walk past a deprived, a child who's been deprived of everything and not feel something, right? So my mum she was used in this form of begging. She doesn't talk much about it. She's never talked too much about growing up, but eventually, I don't think. So it's interesting in like Bengali culture, in a lot of these cultures, there's almost reverence of your parents. And so my mum held reverence for my grandfather. I was born a few months after he died, and so I was given his name as a middle name. And my mum would always talk about him with almost a reverence, but I don't think she actually thought he was a good man. He wasn't. He was a smoker. He spent his money on smoking rather than feeding the children, stuff like that. And so there's reverence, but you might not respect them, or you respect them, but you might not like it, or you might not think they were good people. But I'm not sure where I was going with this. I feel like the point of it was that I kind of didn't understand it, right? Because my perspective growing up here in the UK is very different. I had everything, I had a stable roof over my head. I had television, I had electricity on demand, never a power cut. I had games consoles, I had computers, I had food aplenty to the point I got really fat. I had, running clean water. I'd never have to go out and beg. I had an education. I had all of these amazing things which are just there for the taking for all of us, pretty much. And yes, there are troubles that we might face trying to sort them all out, and all of that, but they're just there. These are basic necessities that we have, but others don't. And I feel like in some ways, I wish my mum was more open. But then again, I feel like when I was younger, I wouldn't understand, because I was spoiled. I was a spoiled brat. My concern wasn't, I'm hungry today. And I understand there are a lot of people in this country who that is their concern. Their child is hungry. But for me, it wasn't that. I wasn't hungry. I was like, why did you cook me this? Why'd you cook so many vegetables? That kind of stupid shit, right? And on the other hand, her perspective was she was protecting me from this darker side of the world. The fact that there are children who don't have these things, and they can't. And at the time, I probably wouldn't have understood it. I feel like now that I think about it, I've been to Bangladesh as an older person. I've seen these things. I think it's important that we see how fucking horrible people have it in other parts of the world, because it should motivate us. It should upset us. We spend too much time protecting ourselves and others and our children from the realities of the world. And the reality is that if we weren't so lucky to be born in this country, we could be, living on the streets begging for a bowl of rice. And I think we should take that motivation to understand why we need to maintain this way of life and improve it, but also to help others who are far, far less well off than us. But on a personal level, I think having this perspective and putting things into perspective, realizing that relatively we have it well off, we can take advantage and be appreciative of these opportunities we've been given, or that we've not been given, but that we have living where we live. And you can take advantage of, wherever you are in the world, you can live life to the fullest and appreciate what you have. Maybe that's a bit, I don't know. Maybe again, with the caveat, I'm speaking from a position of privilege. But I feel that, for me personally, in this reflection, I want to try and, be mindful of the fact that I have so much more, than so many people in the world have currently, and so much more than people have had historically. Like, it's an interesting thing to put that in perspective and just be like, you know what, it isn't so bad. And I kind of talked about it in the last episode, where it was sort of like, realizing things aren't so bad for me. It could be so much worse. But I think it's something that should be nailed in deep. But yeah, I think maybe that might be it for this episode. I think I've sort of covered the main things that I was thinking about. But yeah, I think just put things into perspective. Try to read more around subjects that interest you but are also kind of painful. Pick up a copy of Gulag Archipelago. It's a long book, but it's important, right? To put it into perspective, to know that we have it so much luckier to see these similar atrocities going on in the world right now. Read about the Uyghur, the Rohingya, people who have been persecuted, chased out, their villages destroyed, people being raped and killed, for essentially just living in a part of the world, and you've got this sort of rise in I mean, I don't want to talk too far out of my depth of knowledge, but essentially a sort of a fundamentalist Buddhism kind of taking rise in Myanmar. And it's important that if we can spend so much time giving a shit about what's happening in America, and being almost as enraged by that as what's happening on our doorsteps, we can give a fuckload more time to the atrocities that are happening elsewhere in the world and caring more about those as well. Because I guarantee there are people there who have it so much worse, and they need our consideration and support. But maybe it's just a case of, just today, for yourself personally, reading more, thinking more, meditating more on the idea that you might be quite lucky that you could have it so much worse. Just put it in perspective, calm yourself down, and realize that your problems might not be run as deep as having to flee for your life or to live in a concentration camp, where your freedoms are even more restricted than lockdown, or whatever it might be. Knowledge can give you the power to understand how good and bad the world can be, right? And how we should use this platform that we have to be in a position of privilege to just enjoy life more, to embrace those moments, and just, I don't know, I'm getting really fucking new age with it, but I feel like there's so much to it. When you put things into perspective, you can just realize that, well, we should use it. And yes, it goes back to that whole idea of, I mean, it's almost very similar to that kind of, the whole thing of like, there's that little joke about, you should finish your food because children in Africa don't have that. And, it's kind of made fun of now. But if it weren't such like a sort of meme almost, there is some truth to that, right? It's like, why are you throwing away some vegetables because you don't like them? There are people who don't even have vegetables, and it does ring true. We can often sometimes hide very serious problems and wounds around the world behind these jokes. And there's I feel like, of course there's satire, but it's the blur between satire and just denial is getting pretty thin. Maybe that's a whole nother idea to sort of discuss on another episode, maybe, if I even remember. But yeah, this one's a bit shorter. I think these have progressively gotten a bit shorter as I've kind of gotten used to just doing it and just sort of talking at 1,000,000 miles an hour and then not stopping and then just coming to an end of whatever. Even now I'm just blabbering, so if you've turned off, I don't blame you. But yeah, I'm gonna close it off now. Just have a think about your life and put it in perspective with some of these other things. Pick up a book, read around these issues. Have a great week. Oh, I should. So I've set up a website for this podcast. It's called peppermintphilosophy.squarespace.com, I think. But yeah, so all of the podcasts will be uploaded onto that. The website is a work in progress. It's pretty shit at the moment because I'm trying to figure it out myself, and at the moment I don't have internet, so I've been having to leech it from my work when I've been able to go in, and it's slow as balls. I don't even know what that means. But so yeah, by the time this is up, I'll probably be, I'll have internet and I'll be sorting out the website as best I can. But yeah, please give that a visit. I'll be adding shit to it as and when I can be bothered. Also, I'm going to try and get these podcasts onto different streaming platforms, so maybe Spotify, iTunes, etc. That was weird. I think someone turned on their tap. Don't know if you could hear that, but it was like a weird like ee sound. Anyway, I'm going to stop blabbering. Yeah, I'm going to try and get these on streaming platforms. If you like these, great, thank you. I hope you enjoyed. Have a think about the stuff. I'll be releasing these as and when I kind of get the motivation and record them. So, yep, have a good day. As heavy as this was, just keep smiling, stay positive, put your life in perspective, and yeah, bye-bye. Okay, so I promise this is the actual end now. So I recorded the sort of end of that hours ago, and I'm sort of coming back to this now at like 10:30 because I've just been reading some of Gulag Archipelago, and I just sort of read a part which I think's quite, I think it fits with what the kind of stuff I was saying earlier, so I'd like to kind of just, do a little bit of a shit reading of it, just so it's here. I think the more I read this book, the more I'm thinking I'll probably refer back to it a couple of times in future episodes anyway. There's already a few parts which kind of have given me sort of thoughts to reflect on, so there's definitely going to be some future involvement, but yeah, I think this really sort of ties in with the whole like paying more attention to other things that are going on outside our mind, I guess, or outside of our immediate perception, and to try and be more aware of the wider world. So without further ado, I will try and read this. Bear in mind that by the time you've heard it, I've probably tried it about 1,000 times because I'll probably just fuck it up. So enjoy. This is for an excerpt from Gulag Archipelago by Solzhenitsn. Said that terribly, but this is the abridged version. I 100% recommend you pick up a copy. But yeah, here we go. The only sense the Vlasovites could see in all these events, so as to justify somehow their long dangling in the German noose, was in getting a chance to be useful to the Allies, now that everything was finished. The hope kept glimmering, or rather burning high, that at this time, after the end of the war, the powerful English and American allies would ask Stalin to change his domestic policy. The armies coming from the west and from the east were getting closer and closer. They might well clash over Hitler's crushed remains, and that would be a time when the West could gain by saving and using the anti-Bolshevik Russians. The West simply had to understand that Bolshevism is an enemy for all mankind. But the West did not understand at all. The democratic West simply could not understand. What do you mean when you call yourselves a political opposition? An opposition exists inside your country. Why has it never publicly declared its existence? If you are dissatisfied with Stalin, go back home and, in the first subsequent election, do not re-elect him. That would be the honest course. But why did you have to take up arms? And what is worse, German arms? No, we have to extradite you. It would be terribly bad form to act otherwise. We might spoil our relations with a gallant ally. In World War II, the West kept defending its own freedom and defended it for itself. As for us, and for Eastern Europe, it buried us in an even more absolute and hopeless slavery. Thank you for listening to Peppermint Philosophy.